The World Food Programme's 2026 Global Outlook reveals the dire situation of people facing hunger around the world. The report finds that an estimated 318 million people will experience acute food insecurity, including more than 41 million on the brink of starvation or worse, and 1.2 million will face catastrophic hunger. The organization hopes to help 110 million of the most vulnerable next year. However, a shortage of funds and budget uncertainty could upend that goal. My colleague and host of The Heat, Anna Naidu, spoke with Jean-Martin Bauer. He is the Director of Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Service at United Nations World Food Programme. He first asked Bauer what has drastically changed that we find ourselves here. Take a listen.
We are in a deepening crisis. We're in a crisis that's marked by the numbers you've mentioned. I'd like to emphasize that the number of acutely food insecure people has more than doubled since the pandemic. And in fact, we're seeing an increase also in the most extreme situations, situations of starvation, situations of people living famine-like conditions. Those affect about 1 million people around the world. And right now, for the first time this century, we have 2 concurrent famines, one in Gaza and one in Sudan. The situation is very bad. The situation is bleak because the needs are quite high, and we're also facing unprecedented cuts to humanitarian funding.
Now, you say the number of people who are going hungry has doubled since the pandemic. What's changed? What's causing that?
Well, there's been, of course, the cost of living crisis that took place in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. That's been economic factors have been a baseline there. But what's really driven these increases is conflict. Conflict in places like, I mentioned Sudan, I mentioned Palestine, but there's also been conflict around the world. In fact, the number of conflicts has been increasing, and that drives displacement. Conflict destroys food systems, and it makes it more difficult for people to meet their own needs. That's why today we've got more than 300 million people acutely food insecure. Conflict also makes it harder for humanitarians like the World Food Programme to come in and provide assistance. Low access and barriers to humanitarian access are also a factor behind the reemergence of very severe forms of food insecurity around the world.
Now, all those drivers that you've mentioned, things like the famine in Sudan, in Gaza, as well as the situation that's causing food shortages from the Ukraine conflict, those are all man-made situations. These are not natural disasters or anything like that. So what can be done? I mean, how much of an effort is going to be needed by the entire world to address these crises?
Well, 2/3 of the 318 million people facing acute food insecurity are in these crisis settings. And you said it, these are man-made crises. What man has created, man can resolve. And what we need is action at the diplomatic level to resolve these crises. And as long as these wars continue, as long as these conflicts go on, we need to make sure that humanitarians have access to people in need, that we're not prevented from providing essential assistance to women and children suffering from hunger and malnutrition. This needs to be a bigger part of the international conversation about who we are. We need to make sure that humanitarian norms are respected all over the world.
To what extent is climate change contributing to food insecurity right now?
Well, climate change is a factor that's always been there. And we're seeing that there are more events that are leading to food insecurity. The example of Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean is perhaps an example of what's to come. That storm was a tropical storm and turned into a hurricane in just 48 hours. That's a Category 5 hurricane in 48 hours. That's an unprecedented pace of strengthening. And it created a storm that reached records in terms of magnitude and caused utter devastation in parts of Jamaica, Cuba, and Haiti. This means that on the horizon, as we look ahead to the future, climatic factors are extremely important. I'd also like to add that in Somalia right now, the country is facing a case of drought driven in part by La Nina, another climate phenomenon. So climatic factors are interacting with economic and political factors on the ground to drive food insecurity.
Now, of course, there have to be long-term planning, long-term solutions to address this crisis. But what can be done in the short term? Are there things like food vouchers that could help?
Well, of course, there is the emergency response can to the extent possible, should be based on cash, on vouchers, mechanisms that support the local economy. But what we are trying to do as much as possible is intervene before a disaster hits. We know that intervening before a disaster hits has large economic benefits. A dollar spent in advance of a crisis averts $7 of damage after a crisis. So by being proactive, by being agile, we're able to help people and help our limited budgets go that much further.
Right, and how much of a driver is political instability? Because we've talked about, crises that involve high levels of violence, but political instability, to what extent does that drive this?
Well, conflict and fragility are there. They are factors behind the food insecurity we're seeing worldwide. It's actually quite difficult to not just to classify a crisis and put it into a box. When we see a crisis, for example, in Haiti, which is one of the hunger hotspots in the world, well, there's definitely violence, but there are also political factors, there are long-term environmental factors, and huge risk to things like hurricanes. So what we're looking at more often are what we call polycrises, crises that are made up of very different elements, and we need to have a very holistic approach in responding to these crises.
Now, how can modern technology, and we've got some very advanced technologies available right now, things like AI, things like data analysis, etc. How can that help? I mean, what is the methodology that you are using? I understand that you also helped develop the agency's cell phone survey methodology, which uses data to give you a better picture of what the situation is like.
Well, Anand, I was explaining that when we're able to act early, we're able to act more efficiently. And that early action relies on data. And being able to source data in real time from the world's crisis centers, that allows us to target people with assistance that can be delivered quite quickly. I mentioned the case of Hurricane Melissa. When Melissa was a tropical storm, the authorities in Haiti were able to unleash anticipatory payments, and these payments were made to about 9,000 households in the south of Haiti. They received about $100 per household to help prepare for the storm and therefore avert disaster down the line. These types of early payments, what we call anticipatory action in the humanitarian space, is a very good example of how you leverage data to make a difference, because this is data-driven and we use mobile money, mobile technology to get resources to people who are in a situation of vulnerability. This is what the future looks like. Artificial intelligence can also help us understand what's going on in remote communities all over the world, including those that are affected by conflict and that are hard to reach. Your viewers might want to check out the Hunger Map Live. It's a live WFP tool that brings in data streams on the rainfall, vegetation, economic factors such as food prices, but also recent surveys that we've done by mobile to predict the scale of food insecurity at the highly local level. These are great examples of how humanitarian assistance can become more effective and more sensitive to constraints as they evolve in real time.
Of course, the goal is to bring the number down to zero. There is one country that's had enormous success in alleviating poverty, and that includes hunger, and that is China. It's managed to bring the number of people living in poverty and extreme poverty to zero. Can the Chinese model be emulated elsewhere?
I think what we're seeing internationally is that there are conflicts that are not resolved, and there are situations of violence that are not resolved. And 2/3 of the number that we mentioned earlier on in the interview, 318 million people in acute food insecurity, that will not be resolved as long as there's conflict, as long as people are being driven from their homes, and as long as food systems are being undermined by conflict. So, of course, for each country will have its solutions and its approaches to reducing hunger. We need to invest more in peacetime. But what the situation today is crying out for is for peace, is for stability, is for people who ask nothing more. People don't want humanitarian assistance. They want to be able to tend their farms, to tend to their own life and succeed with their families. And that's what we need to do is end these conflicts.
Jean-Martin Bauer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And to help continue the conversation now, let's bring in our panel guest. Joining us from Oregon, Liang is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. And in Texas, Raj Patel is a research professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you both so much for joining us for the discussion today. Raj, I'll start with you. And I want to say, there were some really startling numbers that came out of the report from the World Food Program. 318 million people expected to experience extreme poverty in 2026. The program says it can only help about a third of those people, meaning more than 200 million people are left vulnerable with no resources. So I guess I want to start by asking you, what is it that is broken fundamentally with the way the world finances hunger that got us to this point? Because it seems like we're going in the reverse direction.
You're quite right, Karina, and unfortunately the numbers are worse. You'll notice that when Jean-Martin Bauer was talking, he was talking about acute food insecurity. And that, just so that we can unpack it, it's a technical term. But what that means is that people who are on the brink of being incredibly hungry right now. But that number, 318 million was the World Food Program projection, but that's half of the number who are subject to undernourishment, which is to have fewer calories than you need in order to be able to lead an active life for an entire year. And that number is, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 673 million. So the number the World Food Program is talking about is people in crisis right now where it's incredibly bad. But there are double that number around the world who are in a situation where they're just not getting enough food for the entire year. It's really hard to fall into this undernourished category. And as I say, 673 million people are in that category. And so your question becomes even more germane then. Why are we underinvesting in the things that cause hunger? And unfortunately, the answer is politics. We know very well how to remove hunger from the equation, and as we just heard, the Chinese solution is actually an incredibly good one, which is to prioritize ending hunger above other issues. And if we prioritize ending hunger, then in fact we can make hunger go away. Brazil, for instance, removed itself from the hunger map that Jean-Martin was talking about by investing very heavily in policies that have proven to work, investing in low-income communities, investing in food vouchers and local supply. And so unfortunately, Karina, the answer is we are underinvesting in fighting hunger because politically many governments have chosen not to do so.
And Liang, let me bring you into the conversation now, because global conflict is also a big part of the problem. In fact, it's the #1 driver of hunger in the world. Currently, we face 2 famines, one in Sudan and one in Gaza. This is the first time this century that we have 2 simultaneous famines happening. Add to that people in these war-torn areas, many of them don't have jobs, they don't have money, there aren't banks to put money into, even if they do. So the question that I want to bring to you is, first of all, we'll listen to a comment from Martin Penner, the spokesperson and head of communications for the WFP's country office in Palestine. Take a listen and we'll get your reaction on the other side.
Markets are coming back to life. Food is there, but prices are still out of reach for most people. A chicken costs $25, a kilo of meat, $20. So many people still rely on food aid, food parcels, bread from bakeries, hot meals kitchens. One woman told us that she feels like her whole body is crying out for different kinds of food, different from the canned food and the dry rations that people have been living on for 2 years. Basically a diet with fresh food, fruit, vegetables, meat, dairy, eggs.
So Liang, what policies really need to change to help break this cycle, particularly when we look at something like peace deals? Do they even properly account for food security in their programs?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think as the both speakers before me talked about, this is really man-made crises, right? So these people, their hunger, their experience famine, mostly because of these wars and conflict and aggressions, atrocities that were imposed on these very innocent people. So I do think that international aid, especially when it comes to very targeted support, when it comes to food and nutrition, is very important. And I think ending hunger in this case is very much to end the conflict, right? That's, I think, the most important solution to that. And of course, because of this conflict, there's also a lot of blockade when it comes to international aid to be able to really reach these, hungry people. So I think, a global efforts really need to be rallied to support these people despite, these conflicts and wars and so on and so forth. I think these humanitarian crises need to be resolved. And I think that is an absolute, I think, necessity. Now, expanding on what you just mentioned in terms of policies, I think I agree with my previous speaker. Hunger is a much broader issue than just the people who are experiencing in the conflict zone. When you look at the FAO's data, when they look at the people that experience the so-called moderate to severe food insecurity, this is basically people who lack regular access to enough food to maintain normal growth and development. That number is 2.33 billion as of 2023. So things may get a little bit better now, but still, that's a very staggering number. And I think, there has been a perfect storm that I think created this surge in hunger, right? It has to do with the pandemic, the disruption in the supply chain, in agricultural production. Remember, agricultural production does have a very long leg. And so all of these are still a consequence of that, unprecedented pandemic. But we also have, the Ukraine-Russia war, and that really affected a lot of food items like corn, wheat, and so on, and fertilizer. And then we have all these, extreme weather events that create the bird flu back in 2023, and then all these extreme weathers that created, shortages in, cocoa, sugar, and others. And then we have this trade conflict, I think, trade war, that in also many ways, I think, disrupt the global supply chain and affected many countries, including, I would say, the United States. Many people in the US are experiencing hunger. As a matter of fact, 13 million children, 1 in 5 children in the United States, and over 50 million people rely on the food bank for their food. And so we're experiencing this perfect storm that really drive up the prices of food and also reduce the access of people to get food. So I think policy-wise, I agree with the previous panel. We need to get the policy priority right, and we can utilize a lot of the innovative ways, right? I think again, the person from the World Food Program talked about digital technologies, and also I think China presents also a very important opportunity to explore all kinds of different technologies to cultivate, more weather-resistant crops and so on and so forth. So all of these, I think, are important as on all our efforts to end world hunger.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of very valid points there. Thank you. Raj, I want to turn to you and ask you, there are so many different financial factors that help exacerbate hunger. Liang commented on some of them, but also countries just slashing budgets and, the health system that's ill-equipped and prepared to deal with these kind of crises, disease, water systems that aren't in place, sanitation. So there are so many problems. It's such a multi-pronged effort to try and deal with them. How do you start?
Well, I mean, we could certainly start by stopping doing certain things. I mean, you mentioned the famine in Gaza. One thing that we could do is for Israel to stop blocking food coming into Gaza. That would be a fantastic thing to stop, to stop doing, and to allow food in would be a fantastic way of addressing that particular crisis. Another thing that could be stopped is the extraction of debt repayments from countries in the global south. One of the things that has cropped up, for example, is climate change. Now, there is going to be incredible climate change no matter what. Again, it's been such a low political priority that we are guaranteed to be seeing many more extreme weather events. But there's a difference between experiencing a climate catastrophe and being vulnerable to it. Vulnerability is another one of these man-made things. It is something that is a political consequence of the situation in which we find ourselves. And Corinne, you've absolutely identified a key one, which is countries are spending so much in debt that they are underinvesting in their healthcare systems. systems. And we have a headline example right now where Cyclone Ditwa has just blown through Sri Lanka and has left the country devastated. Devastated in part because Sri Lanka has, even under a renegotiated debt repayment system, 25% of of all money coming into the Sri Lankan government goes out again immediately as debt repayment. Now, if for every dollar you're getting in, 25 cents is going right out the door, you're left with far less to be able to prioritize on infrastructure, on building robust climate change ready or extreme weather event ready infrastructure, to be able to have emergency services available, to be able to have a hospital system that can withstand the massive influx of people experiencing trauma, and to have an education system that builds up a population that's resilient and understands the risks and behaves accordingly. All of that is underinvested as a result of the extraction of vast amounts of debt from the global south to the global north. And until that's addressed, I'm afraid the vulnerability is going to get just worse, even at the moment that climate change deteriorates and climate change exacerbates the crises facing the global south.
Raj, how much of a problem do you think this is a matter of limited resources versus misallocated resources?
Look, we have seen that countries are absolutely ready to invest in war, for example. Here we're passing a $1 trillion budget to the Pentagon in the United States, an institution that's never passed an audit. And at the same time, in the name of combating fraud and abuse, we've slashed international development aid with the result of many millions of people guaranteed to suffer and to die as a result of that. That's a political choice. That's not, do we have enough money? Of course, we're throwing money left and right at a range of initiatives, not just war, for example, but the sort of freebies we're giving AI, the lack of enforcement that we're giving the chemicals industry, the freebies given to the petroleum and automobile industries here in the US. There is plenty of money available. What is missing is precisely the political commitment to take some of that money allocated, for example, to the Department of War and moving it over to be able to assist not just people here in the United States. And Yang was absolutely right in observing the skyrocketing rates of hunger right here in the US, but also then to be able to invest again in preventative measures across the world. $1 now is $7 saved later, and that's a great bargain, but only if there is a political will to take the money from areas where we know that money is being spent in tax cuts for trillionaires instead to be able to invest in the world's poorest people.
Liang, I want to touch a little bit more on this topic of the amount of money that's spent in war and just read you some statistics. According to the Global Hunger Index, at least 56 countries will not reach low hunger, much less zero hunger by 2030. But the UN estimates it would cost just $93 billion a year, less than 1% of the $21.9 trillion that's spent on military budgets over the last 10 years. So my question is, what sort of accountability is there? Because hunger is also a government failure as much as an economic failure, isn't it?
Absolutely. I can agree with you and also Roger more. I think, again, all of these are man-made crises, right? I think based on the technologies and based on resources, we are able to end world hunger. But I think the politics and the very misguided policies, and also I would say a lot of colonialism, imperialism sort of practices have really kept people, entrapped them in this kind of cycles of hunger and poverty. So I agree with you. If we are able to end the war, right, end all these war spending, we're able to really utilize the resources much, much more efficiently and much more effectively to really prioritize the needs of the actual, the people. Not only the war spending, but I also agree with what Roger has been saying in terms of the debt payments of these developing and low-income countries. The World Bank just published international debt report, and they show that 3.3 billion people now live in countries that pay more in external debt services than what the government spend on health and education. So I think this is clearly that the priority was very much misplaced. We're prioritizing war spending, we're prioritizing making payments to mostly private creditors, because private creditors account for about 60% of developing countries' debt. So we're doing all that instead of investing in our own people's health, education, right, in terms of nutrition as well. as well as, I would say, for example, climate adaptation, right? We do need to beef up all these infrastructures and our, agriculture system, urbanization system, to be able to continue to produce food and to feed people in that, rapid change in the climate. We also need to really invest a lot more in social assistance that we already talked about, as well as, I would say, technologies. I think with a lot of innovative approach, we should be able to, scale up our agriculture productions and really help people, right, to cope with this living cost crises. And last but not least, I would also say it takes a lot of international cooperation, right, when it comes to the trading system that, again, many countries are facing high tariff. And in the United States, Trump just 2 days ago talked about the US needs to increase the tariff on Canadian fertilizer imports. And again, the question is for what, right? And as I mentioned earlier, the US is already experiencing high level of hunger and food insecurity. So, and with all these tariffs on the imported food, by the way, about 2/3 of the US imported food are now subject to tariffs. So again, I could go on, but the point here is, as you just mentioned, and you nailed it really the nail on the head, this is a policy failure, and we could do better, and we should.
And I just really want to quickly try and get two more quick questions in. Start with you, Raj. China has been a leader when it comes to climate change. Should countries be following China's lead and pledging more towards that goal?
Absolutely. I mean, again, the climate crisis isn't going to go away, and the kinds of self-defeating policy that we see in the United States from this current administration is merely postponing the kinds of transformations that are required, not just here but elsewhere, and to be fighting against the development of clean energy and moving us towards a zero carbon future is absolutely absurd. But why would we wait for that to happen? Why would we not undertake it now when we need it? And we understand that the investment now is going to pay off many more fold than if we postpone and wait until 2030, 2035. So absolutely we need to follow China's example when it comes to thinking about the investment in clean energy and prioritizing, again, not just the clean energy, but also the sort of infrastructure that allows that clean energy to be distributed equitably.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for your time, Liang and Raj Patel. And we need to leave it there. I'm Karina Mitchell in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching another edition of The Heat.